What are the greatest stressors in your life? Juggling an impossible schedule between the kids' school and work while also trying to be an attentive and understanding wife? If so, where is God in this mess we call everyday life? In this lesson, Tracie Miles, author and national conference speaker, shares her personal journey of learning to use biblical principles to manage stress God's way in overcoming the stronghold that chronic stress once held over her life. Now, here's Tracie staying afloat in a sea of stress.
There once was a little bird, and he was named Chippy. And he was a cute little yellow bird. He was just so happy and had this huge song in his heart. He was always chirping and singing, and he was the happiest little bird you would ever find. He lived with a wonderful family who took great care of him. And one day, his owner was doing some spring cleaning. And she was in such a rush, and she was so busy and stressed and frazzled, and she needed to get his cage cleaned out because she had that on her to-do list, and it needed to get done. So she said, well, maybe instead of taking Chippy out and taking everything out of the cage and washing down the cage and this hour-long process, I think I'll just vacuum out the bottom of the cage. But I'm going to be so careful, Chippy won't even know that I'm doing that. So she carefully unassembles the vacuum cleaner, and she has the long hose, and she reaches up and very carefully she's vacuuming out the bottom of Chippy's cage while he sits up on his little perch. Well, the phone rang right about that time, and it startled her, so she looked over at the phone for just a moment, just long enough to suck little Chippy right into the vacuum cleaner hose. So, of course, she's screaming and frantic and fretting about what she's done to her little Chippy. And so she throws the vacuum cleaner down. She rips open the case. She's digging through the bag, ripping the vacuum cleaner bag open. And little Chippy's, just in there all pitiful. And so she jerks him out, and she is just brokenhearted about what she has done to Chippy. But Chippy is still alive. So she says, oh, Chippy's so dirty, I've got to wash him off. So she goes to the sink and she turns the water on, and she's just pouring this water all over Chippy, trying to get his little self clean. And then he's shivering and shivering and shivering, and he's just so cold and pitiful looking. So she said, oh, I need to dry Chippy, he's so cold. So she takes the hairdryer on the lowest setting, and she just gently blows little Chippy where he's all fluffy again. And then she needs to get on with her day, and Chippy looks like he's fine. So she puts Chippy back in the cage and goes on about her business. But little Chippy had lost the song in his heart, because out of the blue, he was sucked in, washed over, and then blown away. And he was never the same bird ever again. And sometimes I feel like little Chippy. What about you? You wake up one morning and everything is going perfectly fine, and then all of a sudden you're just sucked into something and you're washed over with this problem, you're just blown away, or your day just, it's going to be like that. It's just going to be a stressful day. And that can make us lose the song in our heart. And it can make us feel, as Shirley said, frazzled and fatigued and frustrated because we're overloaded and overcommitted and overwhelmed. And we forget to enjoy our day, or we're unable to enjoy our day because of the stress that's in our heart. And unfortunately, we think that's normal. We think in this culture of busy chaos, super mom syndrome, superhuman syndrome, super single mom working syndrome, all of these stressful syndromes has become the norm. We feel that everyone expects us to be all and do all and meet everyone's needs. And stress has become, even though it seems like the normal way to live your life, stress has become an epidemic in our society, in our country. But that is not how God meant for us to live. But let me share with you some quick statistics about stress. 54% of Americans are concerned about their stress levels. And this came from several years ago. I couldn't find anything more recent, but I can only dare to venture to guess that these statistics have increased since then. Life is much more stressful now than it was even just 2 or 3 years ago for our country as a whole. So at that time, 54%. 66% were likely to seek help for their stress. 50% believe that stress is damaging their health and their relationships. 75 to 90% of all doctor's visits can be traced back to root causes of stress, from the common cold to cancer. Because stress takes a toll on our bodies and it breaks down our immune systems, and from the tiniest problem to the biggest problem, it can be traced back to stress. 12 million women are depressed. 6 million men are depressed. Tracing back originally, in a lot of cases, not all, but to stress. Stress is an epidemic, and it is damaging, and it is not the way God calls us to live. And there was another study done recently in 2009 by Maria Shriver, and some of you may have been aware of that study, and it was called A Woman's Nation. And it was huge. I don't know how anyone could read the entire study, but I pulled out a lot of information that I thought was very interesting. And she stated some very disturbing facts about stress levels of women today, partially as a result of so many women being in the workforce than they were in years past, but also because we are constantly assaulted by the media with bad news, with information, with images, with expectations, with problems in our country. And on top of that, we have parenting and marriage and jobs and all of these things, and finances and economy and gas prices that bring stress into our life. So it's no wonder that stress is more rampant now than ever before. And here's a quote that I want to share with you that she said in her report. "Everywhere I went, people talk to me about how overstressed and in crisis they feel, especially when it comes to financial security. Women said that they never before have so much asked of them, and they've never delivered so much." And she went on to say that women are hungry for something that's missing in their lives, a place to connect. They say they feel increasingly isolated, invisible, stressed, and misunderstood. And these are the feelings that many of us, although we may never speak them out loud, struggle with. We feel misunderstood, we feel isolated, we feel invisible, we feel stressed. We feel as if we're supposed to be living up to all of these expectations, but inside we're breaking down and we're wondering if we can keep continuing with this lifestyle of being overcommitted and overstressed and overloaded and frazzled and fatigued when we think we're supposed to be able to do it all. And sometimes this leaves us with two questions that I believe all of us have dealt with at some time or another. Two questions that, if left unanswered, can have a huge emotional and spiritual impact over us. Two questions that we probably all have in common. The first one is, does Jesus understand how I feel? And does Jesus know about stress? Does he have the answer for my stress? Does Jesus understand how I feel? Does Jesus understand what I need to do? Can he help me understand what I need to do about my stress? Does that resonate with anyone? Do you ever have those days and you think, does Jesus really understand how I feel? Does he even know what it feels like to be this stressed out? How can I find peace to get through that? Well, several years ago, back in the year 2000, I mentioned last night that I had gone to a women's seminar. Well, during that seminar, I heard God's voice, plain as day, so loudly that I was sitting in a pew and I was just weeping in tears because of the impact that this testimony had had on my heart. And I was pouring out my heart to God. I was asking him for forgiveness. I felt his forgiveness. And for the very first time, my spiritual ears were opened. For the very first time, I was like Hannah was last night. My heart was gaping open to hear something from God. And he said, Tracie, go and share. And I promise you, this is going to sound like another fanatical statement. I should not be sharing so many fanatical stories with you. But it was so loud in my heart and in my head that I actually looked up to see, did y'all hear that? But there were no women running around crazy. No one was looking up at the ceiling to try to figure out where that loud noise came from or to see if God's voice had boomed through the entire sanctuary. It was a loud and powerful message in a tiny, quiet whisper in my heart. But I did not like what I heard. And so I told God that He was confused, He was mistaken, that I am one of those people that would sit back in a meeting in my office and never speak for 3 hours. I did not have any intention of standing up and sharing my story or sharing anything for that matter. And I said, absolutely not. So for 5 years, I stuck to that disobedience. I was terrified to step out of my comfort zone, to leave my career, to take a financial risk, to throw away everything I'd been working for all those years that I went to college for. I worked at a Big Four accounting firm in operations management and human resources, and I had never not worked. I had never been dependent on my husband's income. I was sure I would have to go to Shoppers Anonymous, and I did not want to ask him for any money. So there was a lot of things that I was struggling with over those 5 years, but in the last 2 years, from 2003 to 2005, God made it literally impossible for me to continue working there. And I worked for a man that was not a Christian, and that was very evident in the way he carried out his business practices. And by the time I finally decided to leave, I had the self-esteem of a worm because of the tactics that he had used over those last couple years. But in looking back, I have come to a place of forgiveness for him, but also an understanding that God had called me out of that job. And He had decided, that is not where I have you. That's not what I have in store for you. And I had refused to listen to what God had to say. So in hindsight, I believe I only had myself to blame, because God was just trying to, since I wasn't willingly jumping, He was pushing and making it so obvious that that is not where God had called me to be. So in those last couple years, as a result of being married and having 3 small children and having this full-time job that was more than full-time, a lot of overtime, extensive travel, huge demands, tons of deadlines, and a very degrading and difficult boss, my stress level had gone out the roof. And I had spent probably a year going to the doctor for this normally otherwise healthy person. I was sure that on any given day I was going to have a heart attack and just fall over on my desk, because my heart was constantly pounding out of my chest. It would wake me up in the middle of the night, these palpitations, and would take my breath away. So for several weeks I wore a heart monitor, trying to track my heart patterns. I was going to a gastrointestinal doctor for a lot of issues I was having there. I was sure that I was going blind, but my eye doctor kept saying, your vision is fine. I'm like, but I can't see. And everything's blurry. And I was having headaches and I couldn't sleep. And it was just this constant onslaught of issues. Well, when I finally came to the place where I knew God had called me out of that position and I had to trust Him and take a leap of faith, even though I did not want to do that, but I was at a point to where I could stay and be miserable, where I thought was my comfort zone, or I could take a chance out of my comfort zone and see what God had in store. And the interesting thing about your theme verse being Jeremiah 29:11, I know that's a very popular verse, but for many years I had never heard of that verse. I didn't quite understand what it said. Well, the last year that I was working full-time, God was stalking me with that verse. Stalking me, I'll tell you. And everywhere I went, there was that verse. Somebody would say it, or it would show up in the mail, or it would be on a billboard one day. I'm not kidding. I went by a billboard, and it was on the billboard, this big black billboard with white letters. And I finally got to the point that I said, okay, Lord, what is your plan? I want to see what your plan is. I started to get excited about this unknown plan because I knew my plans were just not working out. So I went to a very life-changing conference, and I told a few of you this at breakfast. It's called the She Speaks Conference through Proverbs 31 Ministries, for people who are interested in women's ministry, in leading and speaking and writing. And the whole way I'm driving to this conference, I'm thinking, why am I driving to this conference? I'm not a speaker or a writer. I like to serve in women's ministries. I love going to events and all that fun stuff. But I almost turned around over and over. But I went to that conference, and God made it so clear to me that it is time for you to trust me, to embrace the call, to move forward, to take a risk. And the Monday following that conference, I resigned from my job. And that was a very difficult time. Although I was miserable there, it's what I knew. It's what I'd always done. It was difficult. And after leaving there, I felt like I was isolated in this prison of my home, because at first it was like I was on a permanent vacation. But then it sunk in, this vacation's never over. And you're here, and you're by yourself, and what are you going to do? And you're disconnected from your friends at work, and I felt very, very alone. But God continued to open doors and show me baby steps. Here's what I want you to do next. All He called me to do was take the next step. Not huge steps, just the next step, whatever that next step was. But my point in telling you all of this is a few months after I left my position, I woke up one morning and I got up and went about my regular routine, and I just stopped in my tracks and thought, well, I feel good. I feel pretty good. My head doesn't hurt. I can see this book I'm reading. My heart is not palpitating. I'm not having any other health issues, and I feel pretty darn good. And what I realized was that my stress did not fade away simply because I left a stressful job. There were many other stressors in my life. My stress went away because I found an unstressed God. God is not a God of stress. He is a God of peace. Prince of Peace. That is not how He called us to live our life. We can still be in a stressful job and have peace if we're dependent on God for that. That's not always the answer. That was what He called me to do. We're not always able to just drastically change our employment or our different positions or get rid of the circumstances that are stressing us out. But we can always find peace in a God that offers it if we ask. And over those period of months when I was at home and I was alone and I was focused on nothing but my Bible and faith and what was God calling me to do and trying to figure out my life, that is when my stress relief came. When I found peace in the one who gives it, and when I began to obey what God had called me to do. So I want to talk about a very stressful day in the life of Jesus. So often we see these pictures of Jesus and we hear that He's the Prince of Peace and He's a sinless Savior. But His life was not always just sitting around in a peaceful situation. He had stress in His life. And just because the word stress is not used in the Bible, except for in one translation, the New Living Translation, it does use the word one time. But just because it's not in the Bible, that specific word, our modern day word, does not mean that stress is not dealt with in the Bible. There's tons of synonyms: anguish, hardships, deceit, betrayal, infidelity, temptations, politics, relationships. There were many, many, many opportunities for stress in the time of Jesus, and He lived on the earth amid that. So there's verse after verse that tells us that we can find stress relief in the Bible. The unfortunate thing is that it's not usually, especially women, that's not usually where we go. We want to go to the spa, right? We want to get a manicure or a pedicure or a massage. We want to go to Hawaii. We want to go to some other vacation. We do relaxation techniques. There's corporates. I used to be and still am a corporate trainer, and a lot of times I did relaxation techniques for groups in a busy, stressful office. And those things are good, but they're temporary. As soon as you leave the massage parlor, you're right back into your stress. As soon as you leave that session where you've had this relaxing hour of breathing and relaxation techniques, you're right back into real life. And that's not going to sustain you. So the ways that the world usually looks for stress relief, there's lots of self-help books out there. If you look on the internet, stress relief books, you will have a lot of choices. But they're temporary. They're not permanent. So there was one particular day in the life of Jesus that I want to focus on today. I'm sure He had many, many stressful days, with the crucifixion obviously being His most stressful day. So this might fall into a close second on what Jesus' most stressful day was. And this is going to be out of the book of Matthew. We're told at the end of Matthew 13 that Jesus had been going around to the surrounding towns preaching the parables, all the parables many of us know so well, about the seeds and the weeds growing in the field, and the hidden treasure, letting out your nets and catching the fish. There's lots of parables that he was teaching. This is also when Jesus ends in this chapter by going back to his hometown in Nazareth, and it's where he says, "And only in a man's hometown is a prophet not honored, and in his house." So this is where we find Jesus when this day begins. So the fact that Jesus said, "Only in a man's house and hometown is a prophet not honored," gives you a little glimpse into how he may have been feeling. So we're going to pick up in Matthew 14. I'm going to read 1 through 12. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the reports about Jesus, and he said to his attendants, "This is John the Baptist. He has risen from the dead. That is why miraculous powers are at work in him." Now Herod had arrested John and bound him and put him in prison because of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. For John had been saying to him, "It is not lawful for you to have her." Herod wanted to kill John, but he was afraid of the people because they considered him a prophet. On Herod's birthday, the daughter of Herodias danced for them and pleased Herod so much that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked. Prompted by her mother, she said, "Give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist." And the king was distressed because of his oaths and his dinner guest. He ordered that her request be granted and had John beheaded in the prison. His head was brought in on a platter and given to the girl, who carried it to her mother. Then in verse 12 it says, John's disciples came and took his body and buried it, and then they went and told Jesus. So Jesus has risen on a normal day. And the first news that he gets is your friend, your cousin, your confidant, this man that you love so dearly has been killed. And not only killed, but beheaded. Such a gruesome, horrific way to die. So Jesus was heartbroken over the loss of his beloved John. And then in Luke 9:9, in this same story, it says, But Herod said, I beheaded John. Who then is this I hear such things about? And he tried to see him. So Jesus is devastated at the hearing about this loss. And now he is anxious because Herod wants to see him. He's after him now. So what started out as a normal day, that he was already frustrated, now he's overwhelmed with grief. He's been blown away by this news. He's sorrowful. He has a sense of great loss. He may have been frustrated and fatigued. Jesus understands those feelings. Matthew 13a says, When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Now, I think most of us in here would remember the Calgon Take Me Away commercials. Do you think Jesus might have been thinking, if he knew what Calgon was, which I'm sure he did because he knows the future, that he would have said, Calgon, take me away? He wanted to get away. He wanted to withdraw and be alone with his grief and his thoughts and pray. He was overwhelmed. But we're told in Mark 6:29 through 30, and also in Luke 9, that it says, On hearing of this, John's disciples came and took his body and laid it in his tomb. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. So when you look at all the Gospels in reference to this story, you get different little pieces of this particular day. So Jesus wanted to get away. He wanted to go away in this boat and be alone and deal with his emotions and pray. But he had sent his disciples out in the days prior and given them the power to heal and to cast out demons and to do miracles. So it says here in Mark 6, the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. So all they had done and taught, all the miracles. So now we have this jubilation, this homecoming of testimonies of everything that they have done in the name of Jesus. So I'm sure Jesus was excited and thrilled and praising his Father, praising what had been done. So he's going from hearing about the death of John to hearing about all these wonderful things, mixed emotions. Have you ever had a day of mixed emotions? Maybe you finally get that job you've been so searching for, and you just want to call your best friend and you want to tell them all about it, but you know that they haven't found a job, or maybe they were recently laid off. Or maybe you found out your friend was expecting a child or someone you know, and you're so excited for them, but on the other hand, you've been praying for a child. Or maybe you learn of a birth and at the same day you learn of a death. It's easy to have mixed emotions. This is surely what Jesus was feeling. He was devastated, but he was so excited about what had happened in his name. He knows how we feel. Let's keep reading 13b through 14. It says, hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed, he finally did get away, and saw a large crowd. He had compassion on them, and he healed their sick. Now, this is a story where Jesus has come back in. There's 5,000 men, and it's estimated up to 25,000 men and women waiting for him to come back. And they're not only waiting for him, they want something from him. They all have their own personal agenda. Maybe it's only to hear his amazing, profound words and encouragement and wisdom and preaching. Maybe it's because they have a family member who they need demons cast out of. Maybe it's because they need healing. They've been struggling. They all had a personal agenda. They all wanted something from him. That would make anybody frazzled and fatigued and frustrated. I've had many days like that. Just recently, I had several appointments that I was supposed to go to on one particular day. My son called in the morning and said he needed some aspirin. He had a headache. Well, of course, the school won't give him any because it's such a hardcore illegal medicine. So he needed me to bring him some aspirin. Well, then my other daughter texted me and said, I left my homework at home. If I don't have it by 10 o'clock, I'm going to get an F. At the same time, my other daughter is calling me and saying she left her cheerleading uniform at home, and they have pictures today, and it's at such and such a time, and I need to get her uniform there. And then I was supposed to take my sister to a doctor's appointment that afternoon, and my mom was calling just because she needed somebody to talk to about a hard time she was going on. And then my husband had the audacity to email me and ask me to run a business errand for him. And I thought, if anybody else asks me to do something, I am going to have a meltdown right here. And I was frazzled because everybody needed something. Jesus had 25,000 people. Can you even imagine or wrap your mind around that? But because he's a holy Savior, he put aside his own feelings and he had compassion. That's what it tells us. It says he had compassion on them and healed their sick. He could not help but care because he feels our hurts. Overwhelming grief in this day, sorrow, a sense of loss, anxiety because Herod is looking for him, celebration because of all the testimonies of great things that were done, sadness and compassion that caused him to pour out his power to perform miracles. Jesus understands what it means to have your life interrupted on a daily basis because other people have needs, and he had compassion. Verse 15 says, as evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, this is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food. Then Jesus replied, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. Now, I'm going to take some liberty here and wonder what Jesus was thinking. Seriously? You're only concerned about yourself? After everything I've done today, after everything I've been through, after everything you've seen, you're concerned that you're tired and hungry? Starting with verse 17, it says, we have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered. Oh my gosh. Everything they had seen, all those miracles they had done themselves through the power of Jesus, and they are questioning what Jesus is going to do, questioning why he's not doing what they think he should be doing. So in verse 18 he says, "Bring them here to me." And he directed the people to sit down on the grass, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven. He gave thanks and broke the loaves, and he gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. So Jesus has to be overwhelmed with all of these different emotions that he's experienced this day, with the sorrow and the loss and the anxiety and the frustration and being frazzled. Everyone's demanding something of you. Jubilation, excitement, compassion, feeling the compelling need to help those who are coming to him for deliverance of something. Jesus understands how we feel. Let's start back in verse 22. It says, "Immediately Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side while he dismissed the crowd." Now, I have underlined in my Bible the word "made" because I just thought that was interesting. They didn't willingly say, "Okay, let's listen to Jesus, let's do this." It says Jesus made them. That sounds like something I would tell my kids. Jesus made the disciples get into the boat. After he had dismissed them, he went up on the mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. During the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. So here we have again, the disciples are not trusting that God has it under control. All the miracles they've seen, all the time they've been following him. So let's think about the situation as we look into the next couple verses. "But Jesus immediately said to them, 'Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid.' And Peter said, 'Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water.' And Jesus said, 'Come.'" So let's put this story in a fresh perspective, a fresh visual. The disciples are out on the boat. It's a huge storm. Waves are crashing, lightning's flashing. They think they're going to die. And then they see this figure floating out in the water. And they think it's a ghost. And then lightning strikes and they see the face of Jesus. And they say, "Oh, it's Jesus." And then Peter all of a sudden has this compelling need to have this reckless faith and want to walk on water. Just all of a sudden Peter thinks, "If it's you, Lord, I want to walk on water. I'm willing to take the risk. I'm willing to jump overboard because I know you're going to save me. And I know you're there." And so Jesus says, "Come." And so Peter steps out of the water and he can see Jesus across the water, and all of a sudden I can only imagine there was a ribbon of calm between him and Jesus. And his eyes are focused right on Jesus, and Jesus must be smiling, so thrilled at Peter's faith. And then as Peter takes a few steps forward, the lightning flashes, the water splashes on his face, and all of a sudden he remembers, "Oh yeah, I'm in this huge raging storm." And he takes his eyes off of Jesus and he loses that trust and that faith and that dependence. And he begins to sink. And so he hollers out, "Lord, save me." And I can only wonder if that smile that might have been on Jesus' face washed away. Because once again, after everything they knew about Jesus, everything they'd seen that day alone, Peter still didn't trust. He still didn't have enough faith to stay focused on Jesus and believe that I'm standing here in the water. Think about that. He was standing on the water, looking at Jesus, and still didn't have enough faith to stay focused. Now, I think when we hear that story, at least in my opinion, it's easy to think Peter must have not been a very good disciple. What was he thinking? Why could he not trust after all he'd seen, after all Jesus had done through him and in him? It's hard to believe that he would still doubt. But how can we condemn when we do the same thing? I can count off miracles that I know God has done in my life, in people I love, in their lives. Miracles that I've seen him work in me and through other people. Miracles that happen around the country, around the world, that can't be accredited to anyone but the Most High God. But then as soon as I'm faced with an issue, or I feel frazzled or frustrated or overwhelmed or fatigued or stressed, I have to wonder, does Tracy wipe the smile off his face? We find ourselves in that same boat so many times where we need to holler out and say, Lord, save me. Save me. Do something. And he will. But if we trust, he can do so much more. Let's finish reading this passage. It says, immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, why did you doubt? And when they climbed onto the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, truly, you are the Son of God. Sometimes it takes surviving a storm to see the power and the love of Jesus. But until Jesus got onto that boat and they saw even the wind and the waves listen to Jesus, then they said, truly you are the Son of God. Is it going to take that for us to believe and worship him truly as the Son of God? Or will we worship him because he is the Son of God? Not simply because of what he does. That's what true faith is. Anybody can worship someone after they do something great. Are we going to worship him in the midst of what we're going through, waiting for him to answer our prayers? Because he will. Being frazzled and frustrated and fatigued and overwhelmed and stressed is not normal. It is not how God meant for us to live. It is not how he created our bodies to endure. It has an impact that's far-reaching physically, but also far-reaching spiritually. Because when we are so stressed and focused on life, we are not focused on Jesus. Our eyes can only focus on one thing at a time. And our hearts have to be focused on Jesus. And I find it very interesting that this is the only story, aside from the crucifixion, that's told in all 4 Gospels. So I have to believe that God knew we would need this story. He knew that how stressful life was then and how much more it was going to be in the generations to come. If it's important enough to be in all 4 Gospels, it's something we need to stop and make notice of and pay attention to and tuck into our hearts. And believe that Jesus knows how we feel. This is just one day in his life of 33 years. Jesus knows how you feel. He knows what you're going through. He understands that. And if we trust him and believe that he sees us and he cares and he knows our problems and he has compassion, then we have the strength and the peace, which is really what we all want, to get through each day and each situation and each circumstance. In closing, I want to give you 3 tips to apply to your life in your goal to become stressed less. And the first one is, remember that Jesus understands. In Matthew 14:14, when it said, when Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. Well, I once read a book called In the Eye of the Storm by Max Lucado. It was written many, many years ago. Amazing, wonderful book. He's one of my very favorite authors. But he was talking about this verse, and he referred to it in this way. It said, Matthew did not say that when Jesus saw all the people, he pitied them. He said he had compassion. Jesus actually felt in his gut their hurt. He felt the limp of the crippled. He felt the hurt of the diseased. He felt the loneliness of the leper. He felt the embarrassment of the sinful. And once he felt their hurts, he couldn't help but heal their hurts. He was moved in the stomach by their needs. He was so touched by their needs that he forgot his own needs. He was so moved by the people's hurts that he put his hurts on the back burner. And I love how he described that. Because as human beings, it's hard for us to have that level of compassion. That level of compassion is truly a spiritual gift for those that have it. Because when we can put our own needs aside, completely selfless, and actually hurt in our gut because of someone else's pain or need, it's a gift. That is how Jesus feels. When we are hurting, and it's taken me many years to understand this, that Jesus understands and He cares that much. He is the Prince of Peace. Number 2 is remember that we can talk to God about our problems. Psalm 142, 1 and 2 says, I cry aloud to the Lord. I lift up my voice to the Lord for mercy. I pour out my complaint before Him, and before Him I tell my trouble. Pour out your complaints. Let's not forget that we can talk to God. He is there. As soon as we say, Dear Lord, His ears are on. We can talk to Him. I mentioned last night, for those of you who weren't here, that we often try to think if we don't tell God about something or let Him know how we're feeling, that He's not going to know. That we can just keep it under wraps. It's our secret. But God already knows. But we can't deal with those. He can't help us with them until we pour out our hearts and be real with Him and with ourselves. And the third one is remember that Jesus is our refuge from the storms. This past year has dealt a lot of adversity to our family, different situations that we've had to deal with. And I've been feeling a little frazzled and frustrated and overwhelmed. So when I received an email from Luann Prater, who's an amazing prayer warrior and woman of God on our speaker team, that she was planning a retreat for the Proverbs 31 woman ladies, I could not hit reply fast enough. She was inviting all of us to come to, and there's about 40 of us, to come to Mama Lou's house, as she called it, to Mama Lou's bed and breakfast, just for a weekend retreat of worship and fellowship and prayer and just rejuvenation. So the weekend finally came. It was just a couple weekends ago, and I felt bad leaving my family, but I felt bad as I was leaving them behind for those couple days. But I was really excited to get there and just to be with my sisters in Christ, that many of us live in different places and we don't get to see each other that often. But I was amazed when I got there at the prayer and the effort and the work and the attention to details that Luann and my friend Amy had put into this retreat. And one of the things was that she had stations around her house. And each station had a different, for our quiet time. And each quiet time station had a different suggestion for what we could do. Well, there was one particular station that had an envelope full of names of God, papers that had the names of God. And we were instructed on our directions to pull out a name of God. And whatever name of God we pulled out, to journal about that. What did it mean to us? How did we react to that? Well, the name of God that I pulled out was El, which means the strong one. And there's several verses listed down here, but it says, He is more powerful than any false god. God will overcome all obstacles. We can depend on God. So as I laid my paper down and pulled out my little journal, I began writing. And the words that came flowing out of my pen in the very first paragraph were, Lord, I always try to be the strong one. I always try to give this front of being the strong one for everyone. My sister has a chronic illness, and I have to be the strong one for her. My husband's business has failed, and I have to be the strong one for him. My mom has different financial issues. She's single, and I have to be strong for her. She is being strong for so many people that she needs someone to hold her up. In fact, so many times she calls me her rock. She's calling. She'll say, how's my rock doing this morning? Or she'll be confronted with an issue and she'll call me on the phone and say, I just need to talk to my rock. And I have to be strong for my kids, and strong in my parenting commitment, and strong in my faith, and strong for my ministry. And after each thing that I put that I had to be strong for, I would list all the reasons why I felt I had to be strong for them. And then this verse came to mind. It's 2 Samuel 22:3. It says, my God is my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation. He is my stronghold, my refuge, and my Savior. You see, I believe God was reminding me that morning that I am nobody's rock. I can't even be my own rock, because He is the rock. And all this time that I try to be so strong for everyone else, I really just need to gain strength from Him. And as I continued to write in my journal, I began to see how over time, over the years, that I don't try to be as big of a rock as I used to be. And I have learned to depend more on God's strength. But the more frazzled and frustrated and overwhelmed and stressed I become, I tend to lean less on the rock and tend to fall back on being the rock, because I lose my focus. We don't have to be strong, because God is. And that's where our strength comes from. He is our refuge in the storm. So if you came in this morning and you have felt sucked in, washed up, blown away, stressed, frazzled, frustrated, overloaded, without direction, needing guidance and wisdom and discernment, it can be found in God's Word. Because true stress relief is really just one prayer away.
It truly is just one prayer away. Tracie Miles is a national conference speaker with Proverbs 31 Ministries and author of the book Stressed Less Living, Finding God's Peace in Your Chaotic World. Tracie's passion is to motivate women to depend on Christ in their everyday lives and lead them to a place of peace and purpose through living intentionally for Christ. Contact Tracie or learn more about her on her blog at traciemiles.com or through